Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gembrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino, and we're back for our second episode of 2014. And just wanted to put in a couple of quick plugs. Firstly, I've now actually put up the show, as well as being able to listen to it on the blog and also through iTunes. You can actually listen to the show on Stitcher, which is an app you can download to your computer or to an iOS device or an Android device, and you can listen to it that way, which is really great because in all of those cases you can share it, you can make comment, that kind of thing, which obviously I'm hoping you guys will do a little bit of just to share what you thought of the show. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the Rootstock Sydney Festival, which is happening in a few weeks on the 8th and 9th of February. And that is basically a festival designed mostly around wine, but there'll also be some other artisan producers of beverages like sake and also some food that'll be involved. But essentially it's designed around sustainable products, sustainable wines, with quite a heavy focus on natural wines. So I'm going to be heading up for that, which should be lots and lots of fun. And I do encourage you, if you're Sydney based or if you're not, you can make it there. I do suggest looking into it because it should be a fantastic event. It's the second time they've run it, and by all accounts last year's was pretty amazing, and this year's should be even better. So today on the podcast, I've actually invited a fellow by the name of Andrew Marks. Andrew's parents actually established one of the more cult wineries in the Yarra Valley region, not far out of Melbourne, and he sort of followed them into the wine industry and is doing some really exciting things, both with wine and with another product, which we'll come back to a bit later in the episode. But I've invited him to chat, and thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
No worries, James. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be here.
So essentially, something I like to ask people just to start off with is what was the first interaction you had with wine in particular that kind of made you sit up and really take notice? Obviously, with your parents having the winery, it probably would have been a bit earlier on.
Yeah, it's been a lifelong involvement, really. And it's hard to pinpoint any one moment, but the folks established our vineyard in 1983, so we really celebrated 30 years of since it's been established last year.
Wow, fantastic!
So I've been around it all my life, but we used to live in eastern Melbourne, and I certainly recollect the long lunches and dinners that my folks used to have. And they used to hang around. Their mates were the sort of the John Middletons and the Peter McMahons and the Reg Egans, so
right,
who Mount Mary Civil Estate and
part of that sort of rebirth of the Yarra Valley wine region.
Yeah, they were really the sort of the forefathers of the modern Yarra Valley, along with Bailey Carris and a few other characters. That they were the people that they used to hang around with, these characters. And
was it through them that they got introduced to wine?
Yeah, I think so. I think they've always had interest in fine food and the finer things in life.
Sure.
And so somehow they found themselves in that sort of circle of friends, and so we used to go and pick grapes and all those sorts of things out at all those three vineyards as all my folks certainly did, and we used to get dragged along as kids from time to time. So okay, yeah, it goes back a long way.
And what sort of drew them to the particular site? Because it's in still a reasonably undiscovered or unknown corner of the Yarra Valley region, which of course is quite big.
Yeah.
I remember actually last year I went along to a tasting that you and Timo Mayer held for Sommeliers Australia, and sort of talked about the fact that there are so many different sort of sub-regions within the Yarra Valley, and even though that kind of area that Gembrook Hill is in is classified as Upper Yarra, that's sort of still kind of it's a bit of a generalisation.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is. I mean, how we came to be there is quite an interesting story, and I guess I could be championing Mornington Peninsula or Geelong or the sort of Gisborne area as well, given that my folks spent 5 years driving around the sort of the dress circle of Melbourne. So they basically wanted a spot to retire to or to live out their days, and they wanted it to be within an hour of Melbourne. And so we just spent,
and there's plenty of options, really.
There are plenty of options. So like all those different regions. So we spent all our weekends in the car back in the very early 80s.
Wow.
Driving around with the kids asking for ice creams and are we there yet sort of scenario. And eventually in 83 they came across this site that they weren't they just happened to see it on the door of the real estate agents in Emerald, a sign, and they went out there that afternoon, and they sort of could hardly be bothered, but they just went out there and checked it out, and as soon as they jumped the fence because they didn't have a key, they realised that they liked the place.
Wow. Okay.
It's just a beautiful spot. It was just a vacant cow paddock essentially, with overgrown with weeds, and it was a cleared block of land, and with a northeasterly aspect, it's actually a lovely little natural amphitheatre.
Sure.
But in terms of grapes in that area, there weren't any at that stage. So
were they particularly looking for a cool climate sort of site, or was that not necessarily a factor?
I think more importantly that might have been a factor, but more importantly they were looking for something with a great view, so somewhere to live. Okay. A northeasterly aspect I think was pretty important for growing grapes, and I think that's turned out to be a pretty good decision. And the rest is probably a little bit of luck in some respects, and they've certainly pioneered that part of the grape growing world of the Yarra Valley for sure.
I mean, that's sort of let's say a hobby farm kind of setup back in the 80s. There were quite a few sort of places being set up, particularly in the Yarra Valley and Mornington. So is that kind of what you would classify as that second wave?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are a number of 30-year-old vineyards in the Yarra Valley and older. There's quite a few people who've been farming and growing grapes for the long haul in the Yarra. But I think we'd certainly be part of that sort of second wave. And there's probably since then there's been a third and fourth wave really.
Absolutely.
Which has made it really exciting. But yeah, definitely.
What in terms of decisions about what varieties to plant, what kind of inspiration did they take? Did they kind of collaborate with anyone, talk to some of the other people in the Yarra Valley, particularly considering that area was and still is sort of underplanted?
Yeah, maybe? Well, I mean, we certainly did. Dad did consult with a few people, and it wasn't unknown. So, without anyone else growing grapes up there, it was a bit of a leap of faith, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think he had a conversation with Reg Egan from Wanturna Estate, who said, it's a cool high rainfall spot. Plant Sauvignon Blanc.
Okay.
And I've got these memories in 85, and we planted. That was the first variety we planted. I remember in 1985 when the first vintage of Cloudy Bay came out. And that was just like this thing of wonder and excitement because everyone was discovering this crazy wine from New Zealand, which really set the foundations for modern Sauvignon Blanc. But
so the market for Sauvignon Blanc was significantly different back then to what it is today.
Well, yeah, it's probably in a state of flux at the moment, given what happened to New Zealand on the basis of Cloudy Bay. It's a bit like the back of the sheep, really. It's done really well, and then it's sort of in that classic sort of rural cycle, they've overexploited something and overplanted and oversupplied, and people are now sick of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc in a larger measure.
Well, it's interesting in terms of Sauvignon Blanc because of the huge increase in demand for Sauvignon Blanc in Australia, largely coming from New Zealand, and there being sort of a few regions, I guess most notably the Adelaide Hills, that were planted with the Sauvignon Blanc. Even with, I've long had the opinion that the Gembrook Hill Sauvignon Blanc is the best Sauvignon Blanc in Australia, that there wasn't as much sort of Sauvignon Blanc then planted, considering the huge increase in demand.
Yeah, well, there is a lot in Margaret River, and that's probably through their association with Cape Mentelles and Cloudy Bay as much as anything.
Yeah.
And they're well known for their Sauv Semillons. It's one of those varieties where, in some respects, it can be hard to be taken seriously at times. Like. And people get a bit, it wasn't that long ago that there were anything but Chardonnay, clubs or, people sprouting, that sort of thing. Whereas I think Chardonnay's come back in a massive way.
Yep.
It's certainly faddish to a certain extent, but also when things get sort of there's the case of oversupply, and people, a market gets flooded, and
absolutely.
and there's a matter of oversupply, and then prices come down, and
overinvestment.
Yeah, and people get a bit sick of it because there's so much about. So I think
well, that sort of did happen with Chardonnay to a certain extent back in the 90s.
It's refound itself a little bit. I mean, in some respect, it's sort of if you stick to your guns and your intention right from the get go is to make a quality product, then
sure,
then you can ride out a lot of fads and trends, and it was style over fashion, and matter over substance, I guess. So,
but even then, when the vineyards were first being planted, you're sort of looking at Chardonnay and Pinot Noir as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the classic cool climate Burgundy varietals, I guess, and it's. The conundrum of modern Australian viticulture is that, and the Yarra Valley is a great exponent of this, is that if you go to certain vineyards in the Yarra Valley, they will say, we make great Cabernet. And then you'll go to the next one and they'll say, well, we make great Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone else will say, we make great Shiraz or Syrah, and someone else will say, we great Pinot and Chardonnay. It's like, how can that be? In such a small area, people espouse. And there are, for all those different examples, there are great producers of those wines in the Yarra, for example.
And then you obviously have the situation of trying to define a style like a Yarra Valley Pinot Noir style. There is almost no such thing because, as you say, particularly with something like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, it is a lot more site specific.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, it's sort of my approach a little bit, and my take on that sort of that line of thinking is go to a region that you don't know particularly well, say Burgundy. And it, for me, as a guy who doesn't live in Burgundy, trying to understand that region and drink those wines, you can spend a lot of good money on bad wine. So essentially, after a long time of spending good money on bad wines, or after a short period of time, depending on how patient you are, you start focusing on the producers that you like.
Exactly.
And you start to get an understanding of how they perform. And typically the producers that you like can produce consistent quality, and there's a reason why they're good. And there's a whole heap of different reasons, their knowledge in the vineyard and the way that they put things together in the winery, and their philosophy and their stability, I guess. And
Because even then, there's no such thing as a great region, or there's no such thing as a great vintage. It's more about the producer who probably will express the vintage better, but quality-wise, it will be more consistent. I remember working as a buyer when I was at King and Godfrey, and being very inexperienced in Italian wine, and sort of trying to understand, particularly with the sort of stuff like Barolo and Super Tuscan, that kind of thing. And a really good account manager that we had from Chembuff and Taylor, Matt Paul, sort of said, what you're better off doing if you're sort of looking at getting stuff for the cellar is actually finding the better producers who are going to consistently make great wine, just be a little bit different from year to year, rather than sort of going, oh, this is a vintage year, or this is a better year, with the producers who are less consistent.
So, I mean, the same applies from Barolo to Burgundy to the Yarra Valley, or to anywhere in Australia, really. You find a style that you like, and that's my approach, and I mean that bears out, the people that rise to the top of the people who are consistently making good booze year in, year out.
Stylistically, what was the inspiration early on for your parents in terms of what kind of wines they wanted to make?
Oh, I think in that respect, the site is really the main determinant. It's very minimally handled in the winery, which is, it gets bandied about a lot these days, but really it's the expression of the vineyard. So, I mean, as a winemaker now, looking back, I'm very lucky that my folks set out with the intention of, making nice wine. And that meant that they would go the hard yards in the vineyard, and they wouldn't chase big crops, and they wouldn't overcrop the vineyard, and they weren't
following trends for big wines and heavily oaked wines, particularly in terms of Chardonnay, which obviously was one of the main reasons why there was a turn away from Chardonnay, because they tended to be so heavily worked in terms of malolactic and new oak and stuff like that.
Well, our site it's an interesting site. It's the southernmost vineyard in the Yarra Valley. It's planted on red soils. The vines aren't irrigated, and it's a very fertile site. So the style of wines that our vineyard produces are pretty much very aromatic and lighter in style. For example, we never have a lot of colour in our Pinot Noir, but I think it's probably well recognised that you can chase colour at the peril of all the other flavour components and aromatics of a Pinot. So that's not really Pinot. The colour in Pinot is not a determinant of the quality of the wine.
Well, I've recently been reading Alice Firing's books, and she talked about sort of visiting wineries and winemakers who do stuff like putting in enzymes to actually extract more colour, which is it's okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, there is an association with colour. A darker, particularly with red wine, the darker the colour, the sort of the higher quality of the wine, which is. It's a little bit silly when you really think about it.
Well, that's right. I mean, we try and it's funny. Like you can make the biggest impact to a wine really in the vineyard. So if we're really going to chase colour, we're more likely to try and open up the canopy and at specific times of the year to get better colour. And that's sort of we're in late January now, and we're getting to the point where the grapes are about to start going through veraison and after that time, if there's a little bit of exposure of sunlight to the grapes, that will actually improve their colour in the Pinot Noir.
Sure.
So, we typically leaf pluck, for example, which is actually just going through by hand and selectively take it's a long process, selectively taking out handfuls of leaves from the morning side earlier on in the season. So that might happen in sort of November, December, or maybe December. Yeah. Just to open up the canopy, get airflow through. And we do that on the morning side, which means that the morning sun side, so it doesn't get...
It's not as hot.
Yeah, it doesn't get as hot or exposed. But we might do the same process, just lightly to get dappled light into touching the grapes, which actually builds the potential red colour pigments in the grapes. Yeah. So, you're better off doing that from my book than dabbling with winemaking tools that are pretty plentiful and, available on the market these days.
Well, I've always maintained you can't fix a wine in the cellar. You actually, anything you do, or theoretically, is intervening with it. And so it's really about trying to capture as best as you can what the site and what the vintage is providing you.
Oh, particularly in small sort of boutique scenarios such as we are. I mean, in a larger sort of scale which is a completely valid part of the market where we're making large wines and, don't have the benefit of just a particular vineyard, but have to make blends and with large volumes. And there's a few more tricks involved or games involved, but that's just part of the craft, I guess. But we're quite lucky just to be producing small quantities of really single vineyard wines straight from the vineyard to the barrel to the bottle. It's pretty cool.
So when did Gembrook Hill start to kind of get a bit of acclaim and start to have a kind of a cult following?
Well, the funny thing with Gembrook is that, and I'm sure a lot of producers who've been in the game for a long time knows that, my mum used to be the marketing manager or salesperson, which basically meant that she'd lug around bottles of wine and case of wine in the back of the old Peugeot 504 and go and visit the restaurants. And in those days, as my folks tell me, and I obviously wasn't visiting the restaurants in the late 80s and early 90s so much, but the restaurant scene wasn't nearly half as vibrant or as it is today. So there were essentially
in Melbourne.
In Melbourne, yeah. I mean, the whole food scene has changed and the wine scene has changed with it. But in those days, if you were essentially in one of the better restaurants in Melbourne, if your wines were listed there, then chances were that you'd get listings reasonably easily.
Sure.
In the other restaurants. And
sure.
It was as simple as that, just because there weren't a lot of producers of wine in those days, and so the wine industry is very much a relationship business. From growing the grapes to your relationship with even with the vineyard to your relationships with the people that you're then selling it to, and everywhere in between. That's one of the beauties of the industry, and developing relationships. And you develop relationships with people all their careers down the track, and today's.
Do you generally find that people are pretty loyal?
Absolutely,
with a strong relationship, people sort of stick with you?
With small businesses, you can really, you can have that personal relationship that I think a lot of wine buyers, in particular some of those, are really looking for. They want sort of like a connection. They want to be able to come up to the vineyard and understand it, and have just a working lunch with us and just have a chat, nothing too...
and to feel that personal connection.
Yeah, absolutely, and just walk through the place and see what it's like, and then they can take that experience back to their customers.
Sure.
And it brings a lot to the experience that they're able to sell when they're selling a wine, and
to have stories, essentially.
Absolutely, and I think that's very important, and that's one of the things that we can do really well as small businesses.
So when did you get involved with the sort of the business?
Oh, I've been pretty late to the business. So I left. I went straight from high school to winemaking school.
Where did you study?
In Roseworthy.
Okay,
so
over in South Australia.
Yeah, in South Australia. So in those days, there were only two places to study. There was Wagga Wagga or Adelaide.
Wagga Wagga, obviously, was Charles Sturt.
Charles Sturt Uni, yep. And I sort of chose the lifestyle, lesser of two evils, as far as I was concerned, to go and live in Adelaide.
Yeah.
Which was then it was a 4-year degree all the same. So
okay,
it was in a position where it was transitioning from Roseworthy back to the Adelaide University campus.
And you sort of were happy, you were enthusiastic about sort of going into the wine business, or there wasn't sort of you didn't feel like there was an expectation that you were going to take it on?
Oh, to be honest, I think I was pretty clear. I think, you can gild a little bit looking back with some time, but I had spent a year on exchange in France when I was 16.
Really?
Yep, and 6 months of that time was spent living on a vineyard in Bordeaux.
Wow, okay.
In one of the satellite regions called Côte de Castillon, which is just the next appellation along from Saint-Emilion. And I just looked at these people's lives, and I thought it was a pretty cool way that they were living.
Very charmed.
Yeah, I was charmed. It was good lifestyle and, good fun and...
Good food too.
Good food, yeah, all of the above. And it really appealed to me. And I could see that I wasn't exactly sure, what I wanted to do with my education. And it seemed like a pretty good mix of, office work and outdoor work and all that sort of thing. So, I was pretty happy to go and do that. So, I mean, there's always been, a question mark about, what you're doing when you're young. But looking back, it's been a pretty exciting career choice, and it's been very rewarding and fulfilling.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I've got two sisters, and neither of them are related in the industry. So.
What did they end up doing?
Well, my older sister is a composer.
Oh, wow.
So she does compositions for music composition for television and film. And she's
scores.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she's also done some plays, and she's done an opera and written opera and stuff.
Cool.
And my young sister, until recently, was worked for Film Victoria, and her job was to attract investment in overseas productions, using Victoria as a backdrop, as a set for films, for production. So
did she meet Nicolas Cage?
Oh, I think she was involved with that film coming to Australia. Okay. I don't know whether she met Mr. Cage. His finest work was in that film that was out recently, whose name is I can't remember right now. I can't remember the name of the film, but
obviously his acclaim is legendary. Oh yeah.
That's his finest role to date, I think. Kick-Ass. But yeah, no, she's so that was her job. So, and she's recently taken redundancy and just been a lady of leisure.
Lovely.
For a while. Yeah.
It's interesting though that sort of all three of you kind of were involved in a way in some sort of creativity.
Yeah.
I guess in a way you sort of with the winemaking and the musical composition, it is sort of looking at the raw material and kind of crafting it into an expression that and trying to find a way that to convey that to an audience. That's really fascinating. And so when you went away and studied, and what did you do after that?
I took up a role with a big wine business back in the day called Southcorp Wines. It was the owner of Penfolds and Lindemans and Wynns and.
But then obviously bought Coldstream Hills in the Yarra Valley.
It already owned Coldstream back in those days.
Right.
So it owned a number of and Devil's Lair in West Australia. So it was a massive business, and that was a really great opportunity. And those years, that was 98 when I graduated. That was sort of like the high watermark of the Australian wine industry in recent times. Really, where exports were booming.
Midas touch.
Yeah, and people were planting vineyards, and it was a golden pathway. But ever since those times, it's really been on, for the large companies in particular, it's been on a bit of a downward trend. And the year after, so they actually had a graduate program back in those days, which I embarked on for 2 years. Yep. And I worked at 4 of their major sites for 6 months each. And then
in which regions?
I worked. My first vintage was in Seppelts, Great Western.
Oh, cool!
For 6 months for vintage 1998.
Bit of history there.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. I loved it, and really terrific wines and great people.
Yeah.
Which was a trend all over Australia where I worked. There was
cool.
then I went to Lindeman's, which is based in Mildura, at a site called Caradoc, which is a pretty large winery.
Sure.
Making big blends, like the largest tanks there are something like 1.5 million litres.
Yeah.
Big. And then from there I went to Coonawarra in 99 to do vintage at Rougeom and at Wynns.
Oh, wow.
And then I finished off the last 6 months at Neurupa in the Penfolds mothership in the Yarra Valley.
Cool.
And so that was great. And you know, there's a lot of great winemakers who are sort of, you know, within the large company structures, you know, who never really see the light of day, but they're consummate professionals and really understand that, you know, what's going on very well with wine. And it was a great place to learn a lot about winemaking.
And then after that, you sort of came...
Well, I stayed with Penfolds for another 4 years after that. And was a winemaker at Penfolds in the white department. And then I finished off with the last year there back to Great Western.
Yep.
In 2003 was my last vintage. And from that point, that was 6 years, and I thought I needed to spread my wings and travel a bit. So I did a few vintages, one in Western Australia and Denmark. And then following that, I went to Spain and...
Really?
Yeah, worked in Spain. I'd already done a vintage when I was overseas in 2000 in America and 2002 in France. And yeah, so Spain 2004, and that was great fun.
Sure. And sort of what, I guess I'm interested to know what kind of set you on the path to obviously be involved with Gembrook, but then to establish your own kind of project as well.
Well, I think, coming from our family vineyard and, you know, and then going to this massive machine that was Southcote was always very interesting to me because, as I said, I was quite lucky that my folks sort of are, you know, are perfectionists. So they set off and they plant this beautiful vineyard. It wasn't the fact that they expect expense. So they don't expend lavishly or unwisely. But
the expense was just time and hard work.
Exactly. And a view to detail, which was all important.
Yeah.
And so to go into the big come in and to sort of like try and see how it all fitted together was really curious. But I sort of always had it in the back of my mind that I'd be heading back to Gembrook. I don't think there was any question of that. And it was part of a pretty fun, something that I've been involved with right from the get-go that, you know, appealed to me. So yeah, I think I was needed to go out and get as much experience as possible from a lot of different parts of the world. So that was good. And speaking,
did it sort of contribute to kind of getting a much deeper appreciation for Gembrook and for home?
I think so. Yeah, in respect to, I think from an early point, Gembrook has always produced wines that are quite distinct and with, you know, that have always sort of stood aside and had a lot of character and flavour that really speak of where they are.
Yeah.
And we bandy around the term terroir wines quite readily these days, but really there's a flavour profile that, you know, you can try Gembrook Pinot in a lineup and you can recognise it for what it is. So it stands out quite well. So with that in mind, to my mind, that makes it quite a special place. And I think, you know, there's also an emotional attachment, and when there's these sorts of things, it makes it hard to sort of separate these things out and be clinical about them. And sometimes I don't really even want to. So, you know, sometimes it's just not really necessary. But I think in that respect, yeah, very lucky to have that. You know, I wouldn't be who I was if I didn't have the folks that I have. Obviously,
yeah.
You were talking about that. You know, that my sisters have a creative bent in them as well. Well, that's clearly coming through from the parents, and I think, you know, they've got great values and everything they do. You know, their personal relationships, like we talked before, and just if they do something, they do it properly. I think I've taken that one on, strongly too. So I always had a strong belief in the idea of Gembrook, just because I know the work that's gone into it and the site that it is and the way that we go about things. So, you know, you could have been unlucky. It could have been a shit site, but clearly, you know, I think they chose well, and they didn't hurry the decision to make the decision as to where they planted that vineyard. They spent 5 years looking. I could, you know, had it been a different site, I could have been celebrating Mornington Peninsula wines and pushing them, rather than Yarra Valley. That's just the luck of the draw.
And I suppose in terms of Gembrook Hill, did you kind of feel it was more like a custodial position, just continuing the tradition?
Yeah, I do a little bit. I mean, that's a really curious one, and you've got to be careful. You know, it's certainly coming in, and in fact, my folks built the winery there in 2000, so they'd already been operating for a number of years without a winery.
Right.
And the wine was made off site for them. But 2000, they had the winery built, and they've employed a winemaker continuously at Gembrook since 2000.
Sure.
So
and that has been Timo?
Yeah, so that's Timo.
Since then?
Yeah. So he's been there for now 13 years.
Okay.
And so, you sort of can't come back as the prodigal son and just, upset the apple cart, really. And that's not really the way that we go about doing things.
Sure.
As a family, I guess. So, yeah, so I've been back in 2005 and sort of working with Timo since then, and my father, and just find the way for that relationship to work. And part of that was clearly that I felt I needed a project on the side just to get, my own project off the ground and complete expression of what I was doing after, the lessons I learned being a winemaker for.
How did you come upon the name The Wanderer?
I spent a lot of time working, trying to figure out what it was I was trying to express. But, I make a small quantity of wine. It's a pretty small brand or label. And I just wanted to, so it's very personal, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so I guess with that name, I could have called it, Andrew Marks Wines, which is, it's what a lot of people do. But I wanted it to be not really all about me, and to convey something of that thrill of excitement or the sense of spirit of adventure that I've always cherished, and it's led me on a lot of fun adventures in my life. And I think a lot of people go traveling, or can even if you can be an armchair traveler like a lot of people and go on journeys, but that sort of sense is what I was trying to convey with The Wanderer.
Well, it's funny because that's kind of the same reason why I gave myself the moniker of the Intrepid Wino.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing that I think a lot of people can relate to, and so that's cool, and you can interpret it, as and how you will, and I think that's important too. Like with everything I do, I try not to put a marketing slant on things and say you're going to like this because of this, this, and this. Yeah, I prefer you to try my wine and say, well, I do like this because of this and this, and I prefer the product to speak for itself rather than me to have to put some sort of slant on things.
And initially, it was just Yarra Valley expressions? Yeah,
it was. Well, my first 2005 wines, they were classic. I should have brought a sample in to show you today. But I made 3 very unusual wines. And by the time I did vintage in 2005, I already knew that I'd been employed for the latter half of 2005 for 6 months to work vintage in Spain, heading up my friend's winery in Catalonia. And so I knew I wouldn't be able to make a red wine because I wouldn't be able to look after it in the cellar the way I would want to.
Sure.
So I made a Gewürztraminer Chardonnay field blend, fantastic wine.
Wow.
I made from the same vineyard. Picked on the same day. From the same vineyard, I made a Pinot Noir Chardonnay Rosé. And I also made a Moscato because I just wanted to have fun with wine.
Okay.
And they're pretty eclectic bunch. And
well, certainly it fits in with the Wanderer, the kind of
absolutely
like that kind of discovery, experimentation kind of thing.
Yeah, completely. And as it turned out, a
sense of freedom.
Yeah, look, the wines were spot on. Like they were really, I thought, spot on. And this comes back to the whole trends and fads in wine. Like, I did comparative tastings of my Moscato, for example, to taste it comparatively against all the other Australian offerings. And I travelled in 2005 to Piedmonte and visited a number of the great Moscato producers. And
in Asti.
And I had some great conversations with them. And
sure.
It was fantastic. And then to make that wine, which is actually the most technically difficult wine I've ever had to make.
Okay.
And I made it for 3 consecutive vintages and made it differently each year with good results each year, but still trying to figure out the best way of going about it.
Sure.
But in 2005, when I did that comparative tasting, there were 9 Moscatos in Australia.
Oh, now there's significantly more than that.
So 2 years later, there was something like 60 or something. It was just mad, ridiculous. And, it has been said to me before that sometimes it's best not to be a market leader. Sometimes it's best to come in on the coattails of what is already a strong market, but do it better than other people.
Okay.
If you know what I mean, because you don't have the resources in terms of money and to push a new product.
The market's been set up for you, and so I guess at the same time, you might be coming in at a point where consumers are sort of a bit almost okay with the wines and kind of go, Oh, and then you come along, you can make it even better and kind of go,
Exactly.
oh, this is a much better expression of what it is.
Exactly. But having said that, I've never really listened to that sort of that sort of research or common sense, and I've just gone and done what I really want to do. And yeah, they were fun wines. I was saying to a friend of mine quite recently that, you know, those cookie blends of Pinot Chardonnay Field Blend, and they were actually really reasonably priced, and they had a cookie label. It was the Wanderer, but the label design wasn't spot on, and I knew it wasn't spot on.
Sure.
But I sort of compromised my position. I'm sure my brother-in-law won't hear this, but I had him design the label for me, and then I didn't have the heart to tell him that I didn't like it.
Okay.
So I ran with it, which was probably the wrong thing to do, and then I changed it the following year for the 2006 release of the Wanderer wines. But so that was a good lesson in business learnt there, you know. Pay for the job so that you can really tell people what you want rather than sort of get something that you don't really want and don't find yourself in that sort of funny position.
Sure.
But, you know, the market has changed these days such that it's actually come full circle. So if I was to release those 3 wines now, the market would be so ready for them, embracing them, because everyone's looking for these quirky, unusual blends that have got a bit of a funny take on things and something a bit different in those days. And that's only going back to 2005, so 9 years ago. Like people weren't ready for it and they didn't know how to take it. So it's really curious. And the price, people told me, put your price up and change your label. And these days, the price, because of what's been happening in the economy, in the marketplace, and there's so many wines from overseas that are competing with our wines. The price point that I actually released those at would probably be suitable to what they are now.
Sure.
You know, so it's very curious what's been happening in the industry.
But eventually, sort of the wines that you were making under the Wanderer label became focused a little bit more on Pinot Noir in the Yarra Valley, and more recently, I think you've been doing some newer things like Chenin Blanc.
Yes. Well, there's a story behind every wine, and initially I started off making Shiraz from the Yarra Valley, and the reason for that was I didn't want to be in direct competition with Gembrook. But then it dawned on me, well, look, there's enough differences between the regions within the Yarra Valley, such that even if I was to be making wine, I wouldn't be in direct competition with Gembrook.
Sure.
Because they'd have a different flavour profile. So, and you know, my first red was 06, and by that stage I'd made the decision that I wasn't going to take a full-time job in Spain, which I'd been offered, which was sort of like that sort of one of those many crossroads
tough decision
that you get offered. Yeah, that's very true. It was a tough decision.
Life in Spain would be pretty interesting.
I love Spain, and I've got great friends there, and I love visiting them every year. But I think a lot of people can get to the point in their life where they've worked for other people and they say it's time for me to do my own thing.
Well, to a certain extent, you kind of have best of both worlds, because you also are making a wine out of Catalonia, El Wanderer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How did you sort of get the idea to make a wine in Spain?
Oh, well, it's just very simply through relationships and
cool.
And so I did this vintage in Sonoma in 2000.
Okay.
And I was the Australian stagiaire, and the other stagiaire was from Catalonia, who happened to be Anna Spelt, who's, you know, now one of my best mates. And we spent 10 weeks, you know, living together, and we just became very good friends.
Sure.
And, you know, we had this little tiny pickup truck that we used to drive around in. And so by dint of long period of time together, we just became great friends. And so when I was back in France, working in France in 2002 for vintage, I just ducked across the border, because where they are on the Mediterranean coast in Catalonia is very close to where I was in Narbonne. I went said hello, and we just renewed our friendship, and so I hit her up for a vintage job in 2004 in her cellar, and worked there, and it's an amazing part of the world where they're situated.
Sure.
And her family winery, and they had a lot of potential for on the upside of what they could do. And I think with my sort of background through Penfolds and from exposure to a lot of different winemaking techniques and modern winemaking in many respects, without being, you know, disrespectful to them, I was able to help them transition in that towards a sort of realising the upside of what they could do. And, you know, these days they're just smashing out some fantastic booze, which I was, you know, there at the start of that journey. I mean, they're a young sort of winery in many respects, but they've got, they own 100-year-old vineyards and things like this. So, what they're doing and able to do is just very exciting. I love going to see what they're doing every year. And I get blown away by their various achievements year in, year out. They're great. And that relationship, making the El Wanderer started in 2008, and I just made some wine from a few of their 100-year-old vineyards, single vineyard wines. Wow. And selected the one that I liked the best out of those parcels that they were able to let me have, and that was the genesis of El Wanderer.
I tell you what, it's a pretty nice excuse to head over to Spain every year.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Particularly, hitting up some of the tapas bars in Barcelona.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun, and I they don't get excited to see me anymore. It's just like, here's Andrew, he can babysit the kids. It's pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah. Oh. But a more recent project has certainly exploded on the Melbourne bar scene, and that is actually something a bit different. Melbourne Gin Company. Tell me what kind of gave you the idea to start distilling your own gin?
Well, it's just a continuation of the love of these sorts of products. I like the bar scene. I particularly like gin. I guess going back to the Wanderer, there's a bit of a literary element in the Wanderer, and I sort of I like my books, and I like the stories of the old days, and love my Hemingway, and you read all those books, and they drive you to drink essentially, just of all the adventures that those guys were having. As far
back as Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, absolutely. So all that's always been appealing to me, and I was reading this great book by Frank Morehouse called Martini, a Memoir. Frank Morehouse, he's an Australian writer who's been on the scene for many, many years. And this Martini, a Memoir, I'm not sure when it came out, probably in the early 2000s. But he's basically been on the lecture circuit, talking about the history and the lore and the legend of martinis. And he's put a lot of this into this book, and interspersed it with tales from his colourful life. And there's so much to learn in this book about martinis, and it was just delightful and a real journey and exploration. And there's a line in there that goes something along the line of, every time it's served, the martini represents the journey towards a perfect ideal drink. And that sort of phrase, that's not exactly quoted, but it just struck a deep chord within me, because that's essentially what a winemaker's trying to do.
Sure.
You're on that journey every vintage to make the unattainable perfect drink, and that's the whole interest in making wine, is that every year it's different and there's a challenge, and that perfection's unattainable, but it's an exciting challenge.
That quest.
Yeah, it's fun. It's generally gives you a lot of energy to go after it, and so that sort of made me think about gin in a new light. And I mean, that obviously talking about martinis, but it just occurred to me that here's something that I could have a crack with, and so very much I live in Collingwood and commute out to the Yarra Valley every day, but I started doing some trials with some just soaking spirits with different ingredients, and then I got my hands on a little 5-litre copper pot still, and started doing some distillation trials in my apartment in Collingwood. And my flatmate at the time started complaining of headaches and having weird dreams, and it was quite an amusing little passage of time. But at the end of it all, I started doing some blending trials with these different components that I distilled, and I came up with this blend that I thought, geez, for a little home job, that's not too bad at all. And on the basis of that, I thought, I'm going to get licensed and do this properly. So,
forgive my ignorance. Can you just take me basically through the process of making a gin?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, gin is made from a neutral spirit, and whether it be neutral grain spirit or other. And I actually use other. I use a neutral grape spirit.
Okay.
So, which is sourced from South Australia. So and the reason I do that is I'm familiar with the guys, or the company that makes that spirit, based in the Yarra Valley from my former life. And
is that made from grape juice or grape skins?
Grape skins, but it goes through a column still, so it's very, very pure. It goes through, it's a pretty highly engineered process.
Sure.
And at the end comes 96% alcohol.
But it's a totally neutral spirit.
Totally neutral. And all gin the world over, like there aren't too many producers of gin in the world that make their own spirit. And so, all the big guys are buying or are sourcing neutral spirit.
Okay.
Be it, it depends on what their most readily available source of carbohydrate is, whether it be grain or, and so then I take that, and my approach has been to steep my ingredients separately. I've got a little hand-beaten copper pot alembic still from Portugal that I imported. It's a Bain-Marie style copper pot still, which means that there's a outer layer there's a double wall in the still, and that double wall is filled with water.
Okay.
And then I apply a gas burner, a heat to the bottom of that, so that heats the water, which then transmits the heat to the interior of the still, which is supposed to be a more gentle and constant heat. And copper being a great, it doesn't insulate at all, so it just passes the heat straight through, the energy straight through. And so then if I'm doing distillation, I'll do like my juniper berries, whack in some alcohol, add a quantity of juniper berries, distill them together, and out will come a juniper essence.
Right.
Essentially, alcohol tasting of juniper.
Okay.
It's extraordinary. At the outset, and I really got my still at the start of 2012, and just before harvest, I wasn't able to use it during harvest because I was busy making wine. But ever since 2012, I've been distilling most Saturdays. And the first, 6 months was just doing experiments, trying to figure out, the first time I started still, am I going to blow myself up? Because I don't really know what I'm doing, And then that progressed along to, well, how do I get the most out of this bat? And I just did trials to start with juniper and coriander because I knew they're the key components of gin. In most cases, juniper berries and coriander seed. And so I just did trials, do I do a 24-hour skin maceration of the juniper berries, like, beefeater 24, for example? Do I do a 12-hour? Do I do less? Do I suspend, as some people talk about, my botanicals in a basket above the alcohol and let the vapor go through the berries rather than having them sitting in the alcohol itself to have a sort of a more mild, lightly flavoured spirit? Obviously, alcohol at 96% and I add a little bit of water as well, so I don't end up burning the bottom of the still. But it's a pretty strong solvent, obviously, so it extracts a lot of flavour and colour out of those berries while they're being macerated. And the maceration is not me actively stirring them or anything; it's just sitting there. So there was a lot of trials and that went on for some months because every day I did a different flavour, but that was on a Saturday, so there's only sort of so many days of distillation that you can do. And, I would have trialled up to 20 botanicals to try and figure out what was going to work. And then being a winemaker, I thought rather than, whacking all these different botanicals in the still together, wouldn't it be better to understand the component, what each botanical has to give separately, and then as a winemaker back blend them on the bench.
Like blending parcels of grapes.
Yeah, of grapes. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
So then I'll say, take 20% juniper berries, 10% coriander seed, and and then try and figure out how they all work together and change around the proportions and put the blend together that way.
And did you blend it prohibition style in a giant bathtub?
I would have loved to have, but no, sadly not. But there's always scope for that.
And essentially, when did you first start releasing it?
So I was released in July of 2012.
Far out.
And, it's been, for me, it's just another one of these stories where I think, to create something, to take something from zero from an idea to, a product is really very exciting and very rewarding. And it's the same with my wine. I'm sure my folks have had the same feeling with Gembrook, having been able to achieve that from a plain, cow paddock to a wine that's been on the shelves for, 15, 20 years. And
if you found it's helped quite a bit that there is has been increasing interest in gin, particularly high quality gin, and demand for it, particularly let's not beat around the bush with the Negroni craze.
Yeah, look, it's curious, and sometimes I wonder, am I in another one of these Moscato phases where the year that I start making Moscato, there's no other people making Moscato, and then 3 years later the whole market's completely saturated. Now the distilled spirits industry being the way that it is, it's very tightly regulated. And
sure.
The record keeping is on very onerous and very exact. And I spend, for every hour of distillation I probably do an hour of record keeping.
Okay.
So, and the excise that one pays on the product that you sell is very, very high. It's 50% or more in my case of the value of the product.
Wow.
So there's a lot of reasons why there won't be a flood of new arrivals, but it's very exciting what's going on in the spirit Australian spirit trade at the moment. It's fantastic.
And I think you might have brought a bottle along to let me have a look at it.
Yep. I brought in a sample today.
Fantastic. I mean, it's quite an eye-catching bottle and label.
It is, and I mean, there's no that package took literally over a year to come together.
Gee, your brother-in-law did a good job with that one.
He did. He didn't. He wasn't employed this time around. But actually, I've kept it in the family, and my cousin Claire Selby, formerly of Studio Periscope, put that package together, and she's an absolute talent.
Wow, fantastic.
And I said to her the other day, every time the phone rings from me, your heart probably sinks because, you know, I've just got all these very hard requests to make of her typically, and But there's a story in the label. I spent a year looking for the bottle, and you know, was going down one track, and then it actually happened when I was in Spain, where these funny things happened. Where I was looking through a catalogue of glass at my friend's winery, and I spied this bottle that, you know, in the same catalogue in Australia that I looked up online, they didn't have the bottle.
Oh wow!
And so I said,
"That's weird.
Yeah, what's going on with this bottle?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's available." So there it was. I scored the bottle, which, you know, wasn't in the Australian catalogues, and so I've been the first person to bring this bottle into Australia. It's from France. It's a pretty expensive bottle.
Uh-huh.
The cork is similar enough from Spain. It's from a guy whose factory I've visited twice now, and he's it's a family business, and he that's good sound, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he produces these high-end corks and goes to the nth degree to, you know, make very good quality corks, and I met him again at this Spanish winery, and so he makes these directly for me, and I import them directly. And then once we had the bottle, which took that long to find, the label was reasonably easy. But, you know, trying to say, you know, the label with this sort of product means a lot. So it's almost the most important thing, what people see first and what's going to eye catch. So that was pretty important. A few keys on the label. So it's the MGC, the Melbourne Gin Company, and it's handcrafted, batch distilled, and non-chill filtered. Yep. So the chill filtering, there's a bit of a story therein, as I pour a glass for you, that I discovered, as you do when you put a bottle of spirits in the freezer.
I can smell it just from here.
It's pretty aromatic.
It's quite a distance away from me on the table, but just as pouring it, I mean, it's even more to sort of really, you know, we're using sort of, I guess, they look a little bit like the real O series glasses, right. Stemless ones. You really do get those botanicals just sort of leaping out of the glass.
Yeah, well, there's 11 botanicals all up, and there's 4 from overseas.
And that aromatic character, because you talked previously about, you know, the fact that the Gembrook Hill wines are quite known for their purity of aromatics. So that kind of was that necessary, or was that purely accidental?
It's a bit accidental, with the exception that I included in the botanicals in this gin are grapefruit from the grapefruit tree at Gembrook.
Oh, really?
It's the grapefruit peel.
Because it has a kind of that citrusy.
That's right. And Gembrook wines, be it this Pinot, the Sauvignon, or the Chardonnay, actually have a grapefruit element running through them. So, you know, there might be that common thread, but the other citrus elements are organic orange, navel orange, picked in winter, and honey lemon myrtle from a farm in Western Australia.
It's quite concentrated.
Yeah, it's pretty dense.
You know, it has that density, as you say, but it's still not kind of heavy and brooding. It's still it has quite a lot of finesse to it. It's very long. It really does linger on the palate quite beautifully.
I was going to say, I mean, I think with the way, because it's these little single batch distillations of each botanical, I've really got a lot of flavour out of that still. So that made the blending very important. And there's a lot of essential oils in my gin. It's quite textural and a bit unctuous or oily without being cloying, and almost an apparent sweetness without being sweet, actually sweet.
Yeah, it's kind of got like a citrus oil character to it, which is interesting.
And so what I was sort of intimating before, that when it's chilled or put in a freezer or very cold, it will louche slightly, and that's a French word to describe the oils, which will actually at very cold temperature become insoluble, and they'll form this slight sheen in the glass. So I could have taken that out by chill filtering my gin, but then I just spent months, you know, perfecting this flavour profile, which would have been a real shame to then filter out. So I think that's the way that it's going to be.
And do you have a particular sort of serving suggestion, or do you think that there is a better way to express the MGC?
Look, what I've learnt in going about and showing this product to guys in the bar trade is that I'm not a barman. Mm-hmm. I really would never profess that area of expertise. I love my martinis. I think it's a really good martini gin because of that sort of oily character, which reminds me for the listener a little bit like a Hendrix in that sort of sense, which is quite easy drinking.
Sure.
It doesn't have the heat, or some gins or spirits you drink and you get this hotness and you're drinking a high alcohol.
Sure.
And even if the alcohol's not that high, but in this case, I don't think you get that from this spirit, which I couldn't tell you particularly why. It's just the way it's been put together. But in a martini, it's lovely. I think a gin and tonic, it works well, but most gins work well in a gin tonic because it really is a gin tonic is a mixed drink.
Sure.
That tastes mainly of tonic and a bit of gin. That's sort of hard to quantify a little bit. I think we love Negronis. Obviously, I think it does very well, executes very well in Negroni. They're the three ways that I drink.
Sure.
Gin mainly, but I'm not prescriptive about it at all because there's a lot of people who know a lot more about it than me, and everyone likes their gin tonic differently, and I think people can discover that for themselves, and and that's the beauty of it all because they can.
Now, obviously for those listeners who are in Melbourne, you are going to find it almost everywhere. Certainly in all the top bars, wine bars, and restaurants.
If they can't, they should ask for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're only in Collingwood, not far away.
That's right, exactly.
Have you sort of been selling it interstate or internationally at all?
I have a little bit no international as well. There's been some. I've had a few emails from people in England and the States.
Okay.
Where can I get it? Is it brought over there yet? And that hasn't happened, and from Europe as well.
Do you find that overseas maybe they have a slightly more dynamic kind of cocktail scene?
Oh, I couldn't comment on that. I think the cocktail scene is just going nuts worldwide, and I think it's openly acknowledged that TV series like Mad Men have had a massive impact on people's interest in cocktails and martinis, sure. and that's and there's lots
old
of
fashioned that kind of thing.
Yeah, TV series that's fantastic. As far as I'm concerned, and the gin scene. There's some amazing producers of gin in Australia, new guys. And there's also that's happening all over the world. In the States, in England, there's new brands that don't see the light of day. So there'd probably be a lot of competition to export it to those countries. I think. Sure. I'm focusing really on Australia. I've only made one trip to New South Wales so far, and the response I got was fantastic. So I really need to go and spend more time up there because that's as big a market as Melbourne, and there's no sort of patriarchal sort of view that the Melbourne Gin Company should only be in Melbourne. I think they just everyone just gets really excited by a quality product. Sure. And it's like the wine. I prefer the product to speak for itself rather than me do the talking.
But in terms of people wanting to buy it or find it in a local market, what's the best way for them to get in contact or to stay in contact with you?
The best, I have a website, so that's www.melbournegincompany.com, and it's a very simple, just a face page. Yeah. But then you can contact me, and I'm pretty responsive.
But that also, the website, I believe, also has the Twitter handle.
There's a Twitter handle, and you can get onto the Facebook too from there, I think. And I've been doing quite a lot of Facebook work. And there's some lists of suppliers on the Facebook site and some great photos and things like that. So I'm engaging in that respect. If there's other ways that I should be engaging with people, let me know because I'm all ears. It's the same with the wine as well. Like they can find the Wanderer on Facebook, and I've got a great website, wandererwines.com as well. Yeah.
Well, there's always the classic address of www.google.com.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So we're pretty easy to find, I think.
But no, you will. I do encourage everyone to seek out all of the products, obviously, that Andrew's involved with that we've talked about today, because they really are some exceptional expressions of what they are. And I certainly appreciate you appearing on the show today, Andrew.
Well, thanks for having me, James. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, as always, guys, for listening. Obviously, you can follow myself on Twitter at IntrepidWino, or you can follow the podcast at the Vincast. Please come and visit me at intrepidwino.com, and all of the episodes are there. Hit me up on iTunes, obviously, and now Stitcher as well. If you can, please rate and comment, because that would be fantastic to hear some feedback from you guys. But otherwise, until next time, bye.